Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway of the house she had built with her late husband. Her daughter Lauren's words echoed in her ears, harsh and cutting, as she stared blankly at the space around her. The once familiar rooms, filled with memories of her life, now felt cold and alien. It wasn't just a simple request to leave. It was a demand, an ultimatum that stung deeper than she had anticipated. Lauren had always been sharp, but this was different. There was no love, no understanding, just a finality in her voice that Evelyn had never expected from the daughter she had raised. Evelyn's mind raced, her heart heavy with confusion. How had it come to this? She had given everything to this family, everything to her daughter. She had poured herself into this house, into her marriage, into the life they had built together. And yet here she was, standing at the threshold of her own home, treated as if she were a stranger. The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming, but even more so was the realization that she had no choice but to make a decision. She could leave. She could walk away, pack her things, and disappear into the silence that had been growing between them. But something inside her snapped. She was not ready to give up, not yet. She had spent too many years caring for everyone else, silencing her own needs, letting her worth be defined by the walls of this house. It was time to remember who she was before she became invisible to them all. Lauren might have thought she held all the cards, but Evelyn still had one final move. She had more than memories tied to this place. She had something far more significant. This house was hers, not Lauren's, and she was about to take it back. The warm California sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden hue across the kitchen as Evelyn stood at the counter, carefully measuring flour and sugar. Her hands, though weathered by time, moved with the same practiced grace they had all those years ago when she first learned to bake from her mother. The recipe was old, passed down through generations, a simple yet beloved treat. Shortbread cookies. It was a tradition, one she had maintained long after the children had grown and left. She always took pride in the small gestures, in the details that kept the rhythm of family life moving, even as the world around her seemed to shift. This house, with its worn floors and creaky walls, had always been her sanctuary. She had built it with Paul, brick by brick, laughter and love filling the air as they transformed it from a dilapidated shell into a home. It was her world, her everything. And yet, as she looked around now, something felt different. The house had grown quieter over the years, its once vibrant energy fading into a dull hum of routine. The laughter that once echoed through its halls had become rare, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that settled between the rooms. Evelyn could still hear the faint echoes of her daughter's voice, but the warmth had long since left her words. The bond they had shared seemed to have withered, replaced by distance and coldness. She knew, deep down, that she had become a fixture in Lauren's life, a background element in the story that no longer held the same significance. She had tried to hold on, to maintain her place in the family, but it was becoming increasingly clear that her role had shifted. She was no longer the mother, the center of the family. She had become, in Lauren's eyes, something to be managed, a presence that merely took up space. She could feel it every time Lauren looked at her, a glance that lacked affection, that carried a silent judgment. Evelyn placed the tray of cookies into the oven, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the warmth of the kitchen, the familiar scent of baking filling the air. But deep inside, she couldn't escape the growing sense of alienation. This house, once filled with love and laughter, now felt like a place she was no longer welcome. She had given so much of herself to it, to them, and yet it seemed like it was never enough. The thought lingered in her mind as she cleaned up the counter, wiping away crumbs and flour. Was she still needed here, in this house she had created? Or had she too become something to be discarded, like the old furniture collecting dust in the corners of the room? As she moved about the kitchen, Evelyn tried to ignore the ache that was settling in her chest. The reality was inescapable. The world she had worked so hard to build was crumbling, and she had no idea what to do next. The evening had started with such promise. The air outside was warm, the golden hues of the setting sun casting a soft glow over the backyard. Evelyn stood by the kitchen counter, preparing the last of the cookies, a tray of them cooling as she worked. She had invited a few friends over, trying to make it feel like old times. There was laughter spilling out from the patio, and she could hear the clinking of glasses. It was a perfect evening, or so she had hoped. She moved to the sliding door and stepped onto the patio, carrying the tray of cookies. Her heart swelled with pride as she thought of the guests enjoying them, of Lauren, who had always appreciated her efforts in the past. But as she stepped into the group, the reality she had been trying to ignore hit her like a wave. The moment she set the tray down on the table, Lauren looked up with that same detached smile, the one she had been wearing for months. Evelyn noticed it right away, the way Lauren's gaze flicked over her as if she were simply a background detail in the scene, not someone she had grown up with, not the mother who had cared for her for decades. "Oh, she just kind of stays here," Lauren said, her voice laced with a light mockery, though the words felt like a slap. It wasn't loud or cruel, but it was dismissive in a way that Evelyn had never felt before. A chill crept into the air. Her hands shook slightly as she held the tray, offering the cookies to the group. But no one said anything. Some took a piece out of politeness, but the silence that followed was thick with discomfort. Evelyn could feel it, the shift in the air, the undercurrent of tension. She tried to hold on to the normalcy, the sense of belonging she once felt in this very house, but it was slipping away like sand through her fingers. She caught a glimpse of Lauren's face as she turned away, her smile tight, forced. It wasn't the warmth Evelyn remembered. No one spoke up. No one corrected her. No one said anything to stop it. It was as though they had all accepted Lauren's words as truth. Evelyn's heart sank. She hadn't expected gratitude, but this was different. The feeling that she no longer belonged, that her place in this house had been diminished, weighed heavily on her chest. She stood there, offering the tray of cookies, feeling smaller and smaller as the minutes stretched on. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. She simply turned and walked back inside, placing the tray on the counter with more force than she intended. The room was quiet. The house felt emptier than it had ever been. She stood there in the kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, the only sound, her thoughts swirling. She had been so sure that this house was still hers, that her family still saw her as part of their lives. But now she felt like an intruder in her own home, as if her presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. The warmth of the evening seemed to fade as the weight of Lauren's words settled on her. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She looked out the window at the fading light, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what to do. 3 days had passed since the awkward gathering on the patio, and Evelyn found herself again in the kitchen, a familiar place where she had spent so many years. But today it felt like a foreign land. The quietness was overwhelming. The house seemed to echo with the absence of love, and the weight of her daughter's cold indifference pressed heavily on her chest. As she reached for a cup from the drying rack, her hand trembled, and the porcelain slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor in a sharp, jarring crash. She stood frozen, staring at the pieces scattered across the tile, the sound of the breaking glass ringing in her ears like a warning. It was then that she heard the footsteps. Lauren entered the room, her presence sharp and sudden, like a storm breaking through a calm sky. Evelyn's heart sank as her daughter's eyes landed on her. There was no warmth in the gaze, only a coldness that sent a chill through Evelyn's bones. Lauren's voice, usually steady, now crackled with an edge of fury. She stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, her body rigid with anger. Her words were harsh, as if every syllable was a weight she had been carrying for far too long. "You shouldn't even be here!" Lauren snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You're old, and you're a burden. You don't have any right to live in this house anymore." The words were a slap to Evelyn's face, sharper than anything she had ever imagined coming from her own daughter. Evelyn's hands shook as she knelt down, trying to collect the shards of the broken cup. She could feel the pieces digging into her skin, but it didn't matter. She barely noticed the pain. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Was this the same daughter who once clung to her for comfort, who ran to her with scraped knees and broken hearts? How had it all come to this? Lauren didn't stop there. She marched over to the counter, grabbed her phone, and began dialing. "I'll call the police," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "I'm done with this. Get out of my house." Evelyn froze. The thought of police, of being forced out of the only home she had ever known, hit her like a physical blow. She could only stare at her daughter, who seemed so determined, so resolute in her cruelty. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She wanted to speak, to protest, to remind Lauren of everything she had done for her, for the family. But the words wouldn't come. Standing there with glass still in her hands, Evelyn realized with a painful clarity that she was no longer welcome in her own home. She had been reduced to a mere nuisance, a forgotten relic of a life Lauren no longer wanted. In that instant, the last of her hope cracked, just like the cup on the floor. She had given everything to this family, but it wasn't enough. She was nothing more than a burden now, something to be cast aside. As Lauren's voice continued, growing louder and more insistent, Evelyn's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She had always believed that no matter what, she would always have a place in her daughter's heart, that she would always be needed. But this moment, this cruel dismissal, erased that belief completely. She was nothing to Lauren now, nothing but a mother to be discarded. And it was in that moment that Evelyn knew, without a shadow of doubt, that her life would never be the same again. The silence in the house after Lauren's outburst was suffocating. Evelyn stood frozen in the kitchen, the shards of the broken cup still scattered on the floor, reflecting fragments of the reality she had just been forced to face. The weight of her daughter's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. She had never felt more invisible, more discarded. For a moment, she thought she might crumble under the pressure, that she might let herself be swept away by the tide of humiliation and hurt. But then, as she stood there, something inside her shifted. It was as though the years of quiet sacrifice, the countless moments she had swallowed her pride for the sake of family, had finally coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. This was her life. This house, the life she had built with Paul, the garden she had tended with love, had all been hers long before Lauren had ever made her feel small. She had given up so much of herself to please others, to keep peace, to be the mother, the wife, the caretaker. But now, in the face of everything Lauren had taken from her, Evelyn knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep giving. She couldn't let her daughter erase her, not without a fight. Evelyn's hands, still trembling, moved to the counter. She picked up the phone and dialed the number she had known by heart for years, the number that once belonged to her lawyer. Her fingers shook as she waited for the call to connect, but she didn't stop. There was no turning back now. The house was still in her name. The years of sacrifice, the love and labor she had poured into that place, were not just memories to be discarded. It was her home, and she would not let it be taken from her. The phone rang, the sound sharp in the stillness. When the lawyer answered, Evelyn's voice was calm, though her heart raced. She spoke quietly, firmly, about what had happened, about Lauren's threats, about the house. She didn't need to explain everything in detail. Her lawyer knew the history. What mattered now was that Evelyn was taking back control. She was no longer going to sit quietly and let others dictate her worth. As she hung up, she felt a strange calm settle over her. It wasn't relief or happiness, but something far more powerful. Resolve. For the first time in what felt like years, Evelyn was standing up for herself. Not for anyone else, but for the woman she had lost sight of. She had been someone before she had become a caretaker, a mother, a wife. She had been a woman of strength, and that woman was still in there, buried under the weight of years of emotional labor. Now she was waking up. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Lauren suffer for what she had done. It was about reclaiming what was hers, about standing tall. The next steps were already forming in her mind. There was no turning back now. Evelyn had made her choice. She wasn't going to be silenced. She wasn't going to shrink into the shadows. She was going to act, and this time the world would have to listen. The decision was not an easy one, but Evelyn knew it was the only way forward. The house, the place where she had spent nearly every moment of her life, was no longer a home. It had become a prison. For years, she had lived in the shadows, doing everything for others, never questioning if her own needs mattered. But now, standing at the crossroads, she understood that the time had come to reclaim her life. With a steady hand, she gathered the papers, the contracts, the deeds to the house that she and Paul had once filled with love and laughter. She had kept them locked away for years, a reminder of everything she had given, everything she had built. It had always been hers, despite the years of neglect and disregard. The house was more than just walls and furniture. It was the last piece of her past that she could still hold on to. Evelyn contacted the realtor, her fingers steady as she dialed the number. The words came easily now, without hesitation. She needed this house to be sold, and it had to be done quickly, without the pomp and circumstance of open houses or long, drawn-out negotiations. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The weight of everything she had endured over the years was now channeled into this one final act of defiance. She met with the realtor, papers in hand. As she sat at the desk, signing her name on each document, a strange sense of calm settled over her. It wasn't the satisfaction of revenge or the joy of victory. It was something more profound, more personal. It was the realization that she was finally in control. For years, she had allowed others to dictate her place in the world. But now, for the first time in ages, she was making her own choices. The house, the symbol of everything she had built, was now in someone else's hands. But as she signed the last document, a burden seemed to lift from her chest. She was free. Free from the pain, the resentment, the weight of her daughter's disregard. The decision had been made with a quiet determination, not out of anger, but out of necessity. She didn't need to prove anything to Lauren or anyone else. She didn't need their approval to reclaim her life. The world was wide, and Evelyn realized that she still had the power to define her own path. As she stood up from the desk, she walked out of the office, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The house was no longer hers, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged to herself. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a woman with a future to shape. And with every step she took, she knew that she was finally free. The finality of the sale hit Evelyn in a way she hadn't expected. The house, the place where her life had unfolded in countless memories, was no longer hers. She had signed the papers, handed over the keys, and walked away. But the weight of it all still lingered in the quiet of her new home. It wasn't that she regretted the decision, far from it. It was just that something had shifted permanently. She was no longer tethered to a past that had slowly turned toxic, but in the absence of that connection, she found herself facing an unfamiliar freedom. In the days following the sale, Lauren's attempts to contact her grew more persistent. The calls were endless, each message more desperate than the last. Evelyn could hear the anger in her daughter's voice, the thinly veiled panic as Lauren tried to force her way back into her life, demanding explanations, pleading for her to reconsider. Evelyn listened to the voicemails, but she didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The decisions had been made. The lines had been drawn. She could feel the weight of Lauren's absence in her life, but it wasn't the emptiness of loss. It was the space that was left behind when something that no longer served her had been removed. For the first time in years, Evelyn woke up in a home that was truly hers. The new place, though small and simple, offered a peace she hadn't realized she was missing. It was a space where she could breathe without the constant pressure of judgment, without the weight of expectations that had once been imposed upon her. As the days passed, Evelyn found herself rediscovering things she had forgotten about herself. The quiet moments of solitude became treasured rituals, a cup of tea in the mornings, the soft rustling of the leaves in the small garden she had begun to tend, the silence of a home that was hers and hers alone. The walls, though bare, felt comforting. She wasn't just existing anymore. She was living. But there were still the consequences of her decision, and Evelyn couldn't ignore them. Lauren's absence was loud in its own way. The silence from her daughter was deafening, and as the weeks went by, Evelyn understood that this wasn't just about a house. This was about the severing of a bond, one that had once been strong, but had frayed over time, worn down by misunderstandings, expectations, and hurt. Evelyn had made peace with that. She had done what was necessary, not out of malice, but out of a need to reclaim herself. She was no longer just a mother, a caretaker, an afterthought. She was a woman with a future of her own making. Her silence, once an emblem of compliance, had become her loudest statement. The relationship with Lauren might never be the same again, but Evelyn had learned to live with that uncertainty. It was no longer her burden to carry. She could look out the window now without the pang of regret, without the bitterness that had once clouded her heart. The house was gone, but it had set her free in a way she hadn't anticipated. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She was not broken. She was whole again. The future was hers to shape, and she was ready to begin.